Hey, what is going on, guys? RvzStealth here, and in today's video we're going to be breaking down the 10.7 changes and taking a look at how the changes will affect each champion's placement in the meta for the coming patch. So let's start things off here with the champions getting buffed. First up, we got Akali, and she's getting a pretty small buff. Her E damage type is being changed from physical to magical, and this isn't even a buff in like all scenarios. It's going to be a buff in most scenarios because, for example, if you're playing Akali mid lane and your top laner is playing an AD champion, your jungle's also AD. If everybody else in your team is AD, the enemy's not going to be usually prioritizing magic resist, right? So having this change to from physical to magical would help you out in that situation. But if your team was heavy AP, if you had like an AP top, AP jungle, and they are going to be building a ton of MR, then this would actually end up being a nerf. So it's a buff like depending on the situation, but it's really not going to do too much for Akali. She's still going to remain a C tier champion. So next up here for Nasus, two different pretty good buffs. W range is being increased there from 600 to 700. E armor shred increased from 15 to 35% up to 25 to 45%. So you're just getting a free 10% bonus armor shred there for next patch, which is pretty nice. It means that in those tank matchups up against like Maokai, Sion, Ornn, Shen, just any of these tanks being played up in the top lane right now, it does make Nasus a much better pick. So we could see him come back a little bit in this patch as a counter pick to those kind of matchups. His W range is also being increased there by 100, and that's just free 100 range. So it just allows him to have better gank assist in the early game, allows him to stick onto his target a little bit easier. So I think for the lower elos, Nasus definitely moves back up into A tier for next patch. Higher elos, he's going to be like B/A tier, but these changes are definitely pretty nice, and they are going to make him a lot more viable for 10.7. And then for Riven, base HP regen increased there from 7 up to 8.5, so this makes her laning phase a little bit stronger, increases her sustain in the laning phase, but I really don't think it will be enough or anything to really move her on the tier list. It's a pretty small change overall, so she will still remain an A tier top lane pick. Similar to Riven, Kaisa is also getting a very small buff for this patch. E cooldown there is being decreased from 16 to 14 seconds down to 14 to 12 seconds. So considering Kaisa is arguably the weakest AD carry right now in 10.6, this change isn't really going to propel her back into the meta or anything. It makes her a little bit stronger, but I do still expect her to remain a B tier pick despite these buffs. Now for Corki, his passive is getting buffed. Package direct hit dot duration is increased from 1.5 seconds up to 2 seconds. Really don't think this is going to do too much for Corki. They've tried buffing him a little bit the past couple patches here, but those changes really haven't done too much for him at all. I just think they need to give him back his base AD or give him back a little bit of his base AD. They ended up pretty much gutting that a couple patches, or not even a couple patches. It was a pretty long time ago, but ever since those changes, he's been a very weak pick in solo queue and in pro play. So I feel like that's the direction they need to go to make Corki more viable. I don't know why they keep trying to like buff other parts of his kits, but it's not working, and he could bump up into B tier next patch with these changes, but I still expect him to be a C tier mid lane pick. So next up here, we got a buff to Xin Zhao. His passive heal is being increased from 10 to 68 up to 10 to 112. Phase Rush is also getting buffed in the coming patch here, which we'll take a look at a little bit later on in the video. So we might see Xin Zhao go back to taking that rune as well. And with this buff here, it does increase his dueling potential for next patch. And if you are a Xin Zhao player who likes to go like Trinity Force into Blade of the Ruined King, it makes his dueling potential even that much better here for the coming patch. So I think Xin Zhao, it's not going to be enough to bump him up into S tier, but he's definitely going to be a very solid A tier jungler for 10.7. Now for Galio's ultimate, it's getting a really interesting buff for the coming patch. It's now going to grant allies in the area a percent of Galio's max HP as a magic shield for 6 seconds. This could be a really impactful change for him. We'll have to wait and see what that percent of Galio's max HP is there, because if it ends up being a pretty high percentage, this could actually bump him back up into A tier or like even S tier if it's really insane for the coming patch. But overall, I can see this being really impactful in a lot of different situations. If the enemy team has like a really bursty AP champion on their team and they're looking to like assassinate your AD carry or assassinate one of your teammates, you just press your ultimate on them, you give them this magic shield. If it's a pretty big magic shield, or if it can get really big, you almost completely nullify that burst champion on the enemy team once you do reach later on. And if you can get like a multi-man ultimate off in a team fight, give your whole team a 6-second shield, that could be really, really strong if the enemy team is stacking AP. Now you do have to keep in mind it's a magic shield, so it's not going to come into effect if you're playing against a heavy AD composition. So I don't think it's like a super insane buff or anything, but overall it should be enough to make Galio a little bit more viable for next patch, and I do see him, especially for support, at least moving back up into A tier. No, Ivern's actually getting two different buffs here for 10.7. E damage is being increased from 60 to 140 up to 70 to 170, and his ultimate's cooldown is being decreased from 160 seconds at rank 1 down to 140 seconds, and then once you get at max rank, it's still being the same there at 120 seconds. But overall, I actually think Ivern's a pretty decent pick right now in 10.6. I think the main issue with Ivern is that nobody really wants to play him, right? Even if he's a strong champion, he's not even going to be picked a ton just because people don't really enjoy the play style of Ivern. So I could see this change actually making him an S tier jungler, but I don't see it like increasing his pick rate a ton. I don't see like a lot of people picking him up in the coming patch because of these changes. He's definitely a very viable jungler even in 10.6 right now, but just nobody really wants to put the time into the champion, or nobody really wants to pick the champion up. So next up here for Wukong, he's getting two different nerfs. Passive armor is being decreased from 5 to 11 down to 5 to 9, and his ease damage is being decreased from 80 to 240 down to 70 to 210. So I think this change is pretty fair overall. Wukong is definitely a little bit overtuned right now in 10.6, so I'm not surprised he's getting nerfed here in 10.7. I do still expect him to remain an S tier pick though. I don't think it's going to be quite enough to drop him down into A tier, but he's definitely going to be a lot more balanced for the coming patch, and he's going to be more in line with the other S tier champions. I don't think he's just going to be like the #1 pick here for 10.7. There's going to be a lot of other picks that are now on the same level as Wukong. So Nocturne mid is actually getting nerfed here. It's kind of surprising because the champion, although he's been very strong for the past couple months here, nobody's really picked him up. He's never had a very high play rate, so I'm kind of confused why they're nerfing him now, why he's like getting nerfed here. But nevertheless, his HP regen is being decreased from 8.5 down to 7, and then MR per level, that's the bigger one there, is being decreased from 1.25 down to 0.75. So the change here really doesn't affect him at all if you're playing him against AD champions in the mid lane, but it does hurt him quite a bit if you're going up against a mage, or if you're going up against an AP mid lane champion. This change is going to affect him, so it's going to drop him down like into A tier in those matchups against those AP champions. I think for like AD matchup, he still remains like an S tier mid lane pick, but overall he's going to be like an A/S tier mid laner now for 10.7. So next up here for Garen, he's got two different nerfs here. Passive cooldown is being increased from 7 to 8 seconds, and then Q movement speed duration is decreased from 1.5 seconds down to 1 second there at rank 1 in it. It's gonna be the same when you do max it out, or it's actually 0.1 seconds longer when you do max it out, but I really feel like in certain matchups, that's gonna hurt Garen's ability to trade in the laning phase by a lot. 0.5 seconds might not seem like a ton, but when you're going from 1.5 down to 1, that's like a really big decrease there in the duration of the Q movement speed. And I think like in certain matchups to where you can be kited out very easily, this is going to hurt your ability to jump onto that target and trade with them in the laning phase. So I think for higher elos especially, Garen is going to drop down into A tier for 10.7. For lower elos, he probably still does remain an S tier pick. It's probably not going to be quite enough to drop him out of the S tier, but overall it's a pretty decent hit to Garen here for the coming patch. And then the final champion getting nerfed here in this patch is Talon. He's getting a pretty big hit here to his W's damage. The initial damage is being decreased from 50 down to 45 at rank 1, but the return damage here is getting the biggest hit, going from 70 all the way down to 45. So this is really going to affect Talon's ability to one-shot there at level 2. His all-in potential does decrease by quite a bit, and just his ability to perma-shove waves also does get weaker here for 10.7. So I think if you're anybody but a Talon main, you're really happy about these changes, because personally, I just don't really like the playstyle of buying Moe boots, getting a Tiamat, perma-shoving the wave, and then just roaming top or roaming bot and not even interacting with the enemy mid laner. So this could be a nice change to bring Talon down in power, and I think that for majority of elos, he does drop down into A tier. I could still see him being a low S tier pick, but nevertheless, he does get a little bit weaker here for 10.7. And then lastly here, we got two other changes to a couple runes. Phase Rush, it's getting his movement speed increased there from 30 to 50% up to 40 to 60% for melee champions only. So this isn't going to affect ranged champions. So like I was talking about earlier on in the video, Xin Zhao could look to go Phase Rush in the coming patch. I know that Darius has run it in the past. There's like certain melee champions, a couple others that I'm probably forgetting, that could look to run Phase Rush. So if this rune does end up being like really good on a bunch of different champions, I could make like a separate video on this discussing which champions are really good with the rune for 10.7, but I don't see it being super impactful of a change. I don't see it being like super OP on too many picks. I still feel like it is going to be a relatively relatively niche rune on melee picks. You have to ask yourself, is giving up something like Conquer or is giving up something like Hail of Blades worth it for the extra movement speed on Phase Rush? And I think it could be matchup dependent, so if you do really need that extra movement speed to not get kited against certain compositions, then I could see Phase Rush being alright. But if you feel like you're gonna be fine, if you feel like the enemy team doesn't have the ability to kite you out super easily, then running something like Conquer or Hail of Blaze like on Xin Zhao is just gonna be much better in those situations. Now, conditioning is getting hit with a nerf here for the patch, so the activation time is being increased from 10 minutes up to 12 minutes on a lot of different tank champions right now. They are doing very well with this rune. A lot of champions that do run Resolve Primary are taking conditioning here, and it just allows them to be pretty tanky there once they hit that 10-minute point, so they're increasing it up to 12 minutes there. I feel like the champions that would run it before are still going to run it in this patch despite these changes. I feel like Second Wind and Bone Plating definitely aren't bad. You can still run those runes depending on your matchup, so I think this just means that you now have a little bit more of a choice for the patch here. Like, depending on your matchup, you do have to think a little bit more as to which rune would be best for you. So that's going to be it, guys. That's going to round out the video. Relatively small patch overall, nothing too meta breaking. I think the 3 champions to watch out for the coming patch would be Nasus, Galio, and then Talon. I think Nasus can definitely come back in certain matchups up in the top lane. I think if those Galio buffs are really big, if the magic shield you give to your teammates ends up actually being pretty substantial, I could see Galio coming back a little bit here in both the mid lane and in the support role. And then for the Talon changes, I definitely think that mid lane Talon is going to take a pretty big hit with those changes. It's just going to decrease his ability to snowball in the early game. With that being said, guys, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to drop a like and subscribe if you have yet to already. So thanks for watching, have an awesome day, and I will see you in my next video.